Thank you, Juan Pablo, for your introduction and the organization of the World Cherry Meeting 2020 for the invitation for me to present at this 9th edition. My name is Dr. Lee Kelsitz. I'm an associate professor at Washington State University in the Department of Horticulture, where I specialize in abiotic stress and nutrient-related disorders in tree fruit. My talk today is going to focus on the physiology of roots and the absorption of water and nutrients for cherry trees. So when we think about what roots do for an orchard, we very often think about rootstocks. So cherry rootstocks have a range in vigors that promote different tree sizes that have horticultural advantages, such as increasing productivity, increasing density, and a lot of horticultural benefits, how those rootstocks affect sign growth and development. Very often rootstocks are used to control the vegetative balance in an orchard, to allow for higher density plantings at closer spacing that allow for higher productivity per hectare and a better leaf to fruit balance than you'd achieve with just using seedlings. But roots have a lot of other functions. So they function from a physical structural support standpoint, where they actually are the anchor for a developing tree to withstand things like wind or other physical disturbances that might cause damage to the above ground tree. They're also responsible for water and nutrient uptake from the soil environment. They're the main delivery point for these critical nutrients and resources from the soil. Roots are also important for energy and nutrient storage. So larger root systems have larger energy and nutrient storage reserves that can be used and remobilized following seasons for developing flowers and developing growth and developing new root systems and also helps them withstand more stressful events. And one thing that's emerging now is a better understanding of how roots affect the ecology of the soil. And the microorganisms that survive in different soil are affected by the root. And we see this in many tree fruit, we see this in forest species, and roots really have a critical function in promoting or inhibiting certain microbial populations. Root systems are incredibly plastic, meaning that they grow in response to their environment, their size, their form, their amount of lateral or primary root growth is all affected by how variable that soil environment is. So things like irrigation system can affect how roots grow. A drip irrigation system can promote root growth in a small ball type thing where all the roots are clustered right around that drip emitter. Deeper water infiltration can promote deeper root growth. Or you can get more spreading root systems when micro sprinklers or impact sprinklers are used. So the irrigation system affects how roots grow. Soil texture has a big impact on how roots grow. From physical barriers to where those root systems are able to grow into, and also where water and nutrients can affect how roots grow. The rootstock itself has a big impact on root systems. So not just on the size, but the shape and the amount of lateral root growth versus primary root growth. Rootstock can heavily affect that. Soil temperature and soil temperature gradients from the surface down to the deeper soil environments can affect how roots grow. And specifically, areas that have high water tables can heavily impact roots and can have unforeseen consequences on managing above ground growth if those root systems are able to tap into a water table below. There's different types of roots. There are structural roots that grow through the soil that form the structure of the root system. And then there's fibrous roots, and these roots cycle annually or even within years. And these fibrous root systems are responsible for water and nutrient uptake from the soil environment. And then there's pioneer roots, which form the structural roots that continue to expand into deeper soil horizons or laterally across the drive row or between rows in an orchard. And these form the structural roots that'll stay year to year, while the fibrous roots will die back and cycle more frequently. There are three ways that nutrients can be taken up from the soil environment. There is interception versus diffusion, or even mass flow. So diffusion and mass flow are where nutrients follow chemical gradients or concentration gradients from high to low through the soil environment around the root. So as roots take up nutrients, they deplete the concentrations right around the root and cause this gradient and cause flow of these nutrients from outer areas to inner areas. Whereas other nutrients, like phosphorus, may not be as mobile within the soil. So the depletion zone is relatively narrow, meaning it's right around these root hairs or root tips where phosphorus is taken up. And then just outside that area, there's still lots of phosphorus concentration. So it relies on root growth into those areas to intercept these nutrients and take them up into the plant. So the soil environment and nutrient types can affect availability within the soil. So we see this classic graph on the left showing the impact of soil pH on availability of macronutrients and micronutrients within the soil. And we see that as soil becomes more acidic, a pH of say 5.5, there's issues with availability of calcium and magnesium within that soil environment. But micronutrients are much more available, like iron, manganese, boron, zinc. As pH increases to say 8, which is a relatively high pH soil environment, we see issues with iron, manganese, and boron availability, where these nutrients become less available in the soil, get tied up under those high pH environments, and we start to see symptoms like iron chlorosis in trees and leaves that can be fixed by foliar sprays, but those underlying conditions stopping iron uptake because of the lack of availability in the soil still exist. I talked that phosphorus was relatively immobile within the soil environment. So this is the distances from roots and ability to take up nutrients. So phosphorus almost has to be in direct contact with the root surface to be taken up by the root. Calcium and magnesium are slightly more mobile, and things like nitrates, sulfate, chloride are highly mobile in the soil, meaning that they can follow diffusion or mass flow from further distances away to the root surface and get pulled in. Cation availability within the soil is linked to these cations exchanging with either clay particles or soil organic matter. And between the roots and the roots will exude protons or acidify the soil environment right around the root hair or the root surface. And that acidification causes the release of these cations and makes them available for uptake. So roots affect the availability of these nutrients by knocking off these cations off of clay particles and soil organic matter and make them available for uptake. So once nutrients are taken up from the soil into the root, they are taken up either through the root hair or the root tip. Some nutrients are taken up more as the root matures, but in general, most nutrients are taken up by young, healthy, white root tips. And these root tips, as they mature, they will form a suberin or a brown layer right around the outside, and they become less functional in their ability to take up nutrients. And then once they take up nutrients, they have to transport those nutrients through the root into the vascular tissue, so the xylem or the phloem of the tree, and then to transport them to the above ground tissue. When you think about water and nutrient uptake from the soil environment, so once it's taken up, it has to transport through either through the cells or through the intercellular space through the cells. The different nutrients will follow different pathways, and then they're taken up into the xylem or phloem and transported to the above ground scion to be used there. So different types of abiotic or biotic stress can affect nutrient uptake. When I mentioned earlier that root tips are responsible for most of the water and nutrient uptake in trees, I draw this figure in 3 different scenarios: a no stress scenario, a mild stress scenario, and then a moderate or severe stress scenario. And we look at this changes over time, where they all start at the same place. But over time, the no stress scenario, those root tips will mature, and then new root tips will form, new lateral roots will form, and then you get an increase in root tips and root structure that promote more vegetative growth and stronger trees. Mild stress, you may get a situation where the trees say, hold on, these conditions are not the best. This is a little too risky for me. So we may see a situation where these root tips will mature, they'll suberize, they'll form these brown layers that'll be less functional for taking up water and nutrients, but they won't really die back. They won't be damaged. They'll just sit there and wait until better conditions come around, whether it's decrease in soil temperature or an increase in soil water availability, or maybe there's a fertilizer application applied that promotes root growth, things like that. So I'll just sit there and wait for better conditions. Moderate to severe stress is where you can have situations where the tree will say, hold on, these conditions are not good, but they'll become so bad that these lateral roots will start to die off. And generally the structure will still stay the same, but they'll lose lateral roots. So that's an energy cost to the tree. They have to reproduce those lateral roots. They are more susceptible to biotic disease infection at the root when they have this dieback and loss of these lateral roots. And then the root system itself will prioritize these primary structural roots and just hold on for those better conditions. And when they emerge, they have to regrow more of that structure, more of that lateral structure than they would have under a more mild stress. And that's energy cost to the tree. So there's lots of different types of abiotic and biotic stress for roots. Things like increased temperature can cause issues with oxygen availability in the soil, increased respiration, which is an energy cost to the roots. It can affect nutrient uptake. Different types of nutrients affect root growth differently. And also different concentrations of those nutrients affect root growth differently. You can have interactions between them where an increase in nitrogen causes an increase in root growth, especially lateral root growth. And that also would increase phosphorus uptake because phosphorus relies on that interception of the root in the soil environment to take up those nutrients. So we see interactions between nutrients or where deficiencies can cause issues in how roots grow. When we look at water logging, that can cause issues in the soil in terms of root health, where there's not enough oxygen for those roots to respire and grow. Nutrient deficiencies. So here's a classic example of phosphorus deficiencies in basil, this red color. Biotic stress like Phytophthora that cause damage to roots, to lateral roots, and the ability to acquire nutrients and water from the soil is diminished. And in drought environments, different rootstocks and different root growth patterns can have differences in the ability of a tree to withstand drought, and especially temporary drought. So if you have a different rootstock, it might have a deeper root system, it might have greater energy reserves or storage reserves that have the ability to withstand smaller or longer periods of drought. And I think there's some opportunities there for not just water use efficiencies, but having trees survive these water limited periods that are existing more and more. So roots, and I talked about roots and soils interacting with each other, and that interactions area forms the rhizosphere. And the rhizosphere is an incredibly active area. There's a lot of microbial diversity within that area. The roots really affect the soil, and the soil affect roots, and this interaction is incredibly strong. Roots will exude carbohydrates, they'll exude chemicals that either promote or inhibit specific microorganisms that might be beneficial or harmful to them. They can affect nutrient availability. They can, and then there's also the endorhizosphere, which is inside the root system. And there's increasing evidence that the microorganisms that exist within roots themselves can affect things like stress tolerance and drought tolerance, and affect nutrient uptake and nutrient fixation. So there's just an increasing amount of evidence that this complex interaction between the soil and root is incredibly important for nutrient cycling, promoting a strong microbial community. And so when you pull out a root and there's a bunch of soil stuck to it, that's the rhizosphere. That's all of the soil particles that have been impacted by exudates and by chemical compounds that have been given off by the root to either promote or inhibit specific microbial growth or nutrient availability. So this is an example I like to show of how different roots, or how one seedling, so this is one seedling taken from a forest, can have incredible diversity in mycorrhizal associations. So mycorrhizae are fungus associations with roots, and they're synergistic, meaning that both organisms benefit from this interaction. So the tree benefits by having increased surface area for absorption of immobile nutrients like phosphorus, where you see that these hyphae, or increased surface area, increase the amount of area available to absorb nutrients from the soil environment. They extend the reach further. And the fungus gains carbohydrates and energy from the trees. So this is two-way interaction where both sides benefit. And this is just showing the diversity that exists. So this is 4 different species of mycorrhizae that exist on one tiny little tree seedling taken in a natural forest. And so much of this is just not understood yet, especially from a tree fruit perspective. We just don't understand these microbial associations enough to draw conclusions on what functions they might have in an orchard environment. So once nutrients are taken up from the soil environment and they're transported to the xylem to be transported to the cyan, to either developing fruit or developing leaves or developing shoots, it's really important to understand which nutrients are mobile. So nitrogen, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus. And these nutrients are mobile, meaning that when they end up in a leaf or they end up in a fruit or they end up in a developing shoot or a bud, they're mobile, meaning that they could be remobilized and pulled into areas where they might be needed. Where other nutrients like calcium are not mobile, meaning that once calcium is into the leaves where most of the transpiration occurs, it can't be pulled into fruit. So once there's deficiencies in calcium in fruit, it's very difficult to correct. And this really applies for apples, but it also applies for cherries as well, where low calcium is caused by excessive vigor and balance, where most of the calcium is ending up in the developing leaves, and the plant cannot correct for that because calcium is not mobile in the phloem. And we see this in nutrient distribution in the tree. So when you look at going from the bottom of the tree to the upper part of the tree, we see calcium increase in concentration as you go up the tree, where most of the transpiration is occurring, because that's where the leaves are the most exposed to heat and wind and light, and that's where most of the water loss is occurring. So more calcium up in the upper part of the tree and less in the lower part of the tree. Whereas potassium is plant mobile, so it's relatively well distributed within the tree because it keeps that balance itself. And we see how this relates to bitter pit, where there's lower amounts of bitter pit in apple in the upper part of the tree compared to the lower part of the tree. And these same sort of principles would likely apply to other tree fruit as well. So it's not just distribution within the tree that's important, but for developing fruit, most of the calcium uptake occurs early in the season. So these are cherries that were removed and then exposed to a dye at different points during fruit development. And during early fruit development, when there's dye present, it means that there's xylem uptake of nutrients into that developing fruit. So you see the green fruit stage, there's dye, early on there's dye. We see this transition at pit hardening to more dye present in the pit area of the cherry, and no dye present in the fruit. So that means no calcium is being taken up into those areas. And you see as the fruit develops that even the pit becomes unable to take up calcium. So you see this change that occurs for cherries, and we see the same for apples. We see the same for all different types of fruit, that as fruit matures, its ability to take up nutrients through the xylem is inhibited. And because calcium is not phloem mobile, calcium uptake late in the season is heavily diminished. So this nutrient balance is important for cherries because of cracking disorders or susceptibility to cracking, pitting, and that could be an issue for some varieties. Fruit firmness, stem greenness. Calcium has been shown to factor into all of those traits that lead to a good quality cherry, if those all can be reduced. One thing I'll just end with is that really we don't understand whether there are nutrient preferences for specific rootstocks. I've gone through some of the principles of how different roots might preferentially take up different nutrients or promote a different rhizosphere composition that might affect nutrient availability, or might grow differently to acquire nutrients from different areas of the soil. But we don't really understand of really specifically what cherry rootstocks are in terms of their preference to take up, say, nitrogen or calcium or potassium from the soil environment, and how that might lead to either better or worse quality fruit within specific size categories. So I think there's really an opportunity to do a little bit more work in this area in the future. So I'll end on this, that really healthy roots are critical for sufficient water and nutrient uptake. This has large implications for final fruit quality, final fruit size, and tree management. So if you have healthy roots with good water and nutrient uptake into the large, well-developed fruit, of course, there's balancing vigor and fruit growth that's important. But in general, healthy roots are critical, especially in cherries. Roots influence seasonal storage of nutrients. So bigger root systems have bigger storage capacity for nutrients and energy for the following season that affects vigor and management of the tree. We see more and more this complex interaction between soil and the roots, and how soil affects root processes and vice versa. So it's this constant feedback. It isn't soil affecting root growth or roots growing into soil. It's this interaction between the two and constant adjustment to a highly heterogeneous dynamic environment over both time and space. See, the healthy soils are critical for a stable supply of nutrients to the root. So nutrients or soils that have a good balance of microorganisms, both beneficial microorganisms that increase the availability of nutrients and enable root growth, are important for any orchard. And I'd just like to point out this new review that we just published a couple months ago, talking about just recent advancements in all of these concepts that I presented today. And I just encourage you all, if you're interested, to take a read at that. And I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Lee. Realmente interesante. Suelos sanos, raíces sanas, esa interacción muy relevante para tener una planta, desarrollo, finalmente frutos sanos, de buena calidad, de buen calibre, de buen color. Muy interesante, y te esperamos, Lee, en el panel de expertos en un momento más. Y queremos destacar la participación de la empresa Río Claro, especialistas en soluciones en madera impregnada para el agro y la fruticultura. Actualmente Río Claro es líder en la venta de estructuras de formación y estructuras de protección en Chile y en Latinoamérica, gracias a sus exigentes estándares de calidad e innovación permanente en sus productos, donde destacan los postes centrales, esquineros, cabezales y tutores. Visita el stand de Río Claro aquí, a un clic en nuestra plataforma. Y junto con visitar a Río Claro, por supuesto también los invitamos a visitar a las más de 30 empresas que están participando con un stand en este evento ahí en la plataforma. Y como ya se habrán dado cuenta, aparte de estas ponencias extraordinarias, en este evento estamos regalando esta agenda técnica de PEC Chile, ya se las mostré, un curso en formato e-learning de PEC y publicaciones en revista PEC Magazine y en portal Agro Chile. Todos estos regalos se sortearán y entregarán mañana al finalizar nuestro evento. Lo invitamos ahora a seguir la transmisión en vivo y ganar uno de estos premios, especialmente, como digo, mañana, además de que no se repetirán las ponencias expuestas en este seminario. Ojo, este seminario no va a ser grabado, es ahora en vivo para poder escuchar, así que quienes estén escuchando, avisen ustedes que rápidamente se conecten y puedan seguir oyendo y escuchando estas interesantes ponencias que estamos teniendo y que vamos a seguir teniendo. A continuación, con la transmisión, vamos a dar paso a la siguiente ponencia, donde desde ya destacamos la colaboración de Siren, que por medio de su unidad de agroclima quisieron estar presentes en este 9º Encuentro Mundial del Cerezo, para hablarnos de las nuevas tecnologías y su eficiencia en el riego. Esta ponencia está a cargo del señor Gonzalo Barrientos, quien es magíster en Economía Agraria. Adelante, Gonzalo, y gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación.